This is a lecture on art of the Americas before 1500. And so this period covers what used to be called pre-Columbian art, certainly when I took art history, but that was a while back, and today the preferred term is art of either just the Americas, or in this case we're going to focus on first the art of Mesoamerica, which is in essence Mexico and Central America, the countries between Panama and northern Mexico that were ancient cultures. And in this part of the Western Hemisphere, Mesoamerican urban civilizations were one of the 5 oldest urban civilizations on Earth, along with Egypt, Babylon, India, and China that we're covering in this class. And then we will see art also, though, from toward the latter half of this lecture, from Peru, from the Inca culture, and from Plains Indians of North America. Okay. This slide, first one of Art of the Americas, is the founding of Tenochtitlan. That's Tenochtitlan. And it's from 1545. Now that's after 1500, but the artwork represents the city of Tenochtitlan, the capital of the Aztec Empire, as it was before the Spanish arrived in 1521. So it was done by a scribe, or a highly educated priest, a sort of a historian of Aztec culture, who had been born and raised during the latter phase of Aztec culture before the Spanish arrived, and was working from his memory of what the city was like before, of course, I think almost everyone knows, the Spanish destroyed it after they conquered the Aztecs. Tenochtitlan was, some people feel, the largest city on Earth, but if it wasn't the largest, it was one of the 2 or 3 largest. The population estimates vary between 500,000 and 1 million, so certainly somewhere at the lower end of that range at least would make it a major city today, even if it was in the range of 500,000 or several 100,000. It was bigger than, at that time, any city in Europe. Perhaps a couple of cities in Asia would have been as large. So it was a major metropolis. And this map, drawn as part of a codex or book created for the viceroy, or in essence governor, the Spanish governor of the new province of Mexico, was a stylized or simplified image of what the main features of the central part of the city were. For instance, the blue lines that create an X are representing the canals that bisected the city. The eagle resting or landing on a cactus which grows out of a stone, that's a symbol for Tenochtitlan, and it still is today the symbol for Mexico City, the modern city that the Spanish replaced it with. Then we have the leaders of various sections of the city, or in general the Aztec leadership, represented by the kneeling figures in each of the 4 quadrants around the central image of the eagle. And then we have Aztec warriors down below, who of course were the force that conquered almost all the neighboring tribes and held them under their control for well over 150 years before the Spanish arrived in the Aztec Empire. You see them with their shields and clubs. And then around the outer edge, the blue lines are symbolic of the large lake that surrounded all of Tenochtitlan, the entire city, which helped protect it, but not enough from the Spanish, obviously. But from, excuse me, most of the enemies who would ever try to attack the city would have been repelled before they could even cross that lake. So this was done as a document, a historical document, to record what the city was like before those people who had survived the invasion and conquest by the Spanish forgot what the city had been like and it was done at the order of the Spanish viceroy. Now, this is obviously cool on the blue lines everywhere, warm on most everything else, on the human figures and the eagle. The cactus is cool, of course. There's thin outline around most of the figures, just about everywhere. There's little to no modeling. There is some on the eagle, and possibly a little bit on the cactus. But other than that, there isn't really any modeling. And there's implied textures, I guess you could say simulated on the heads and headdresses of the leaders and the warriors down below. And certainly there is simulated texture on the eagle and the cactus. For space, the only technique is overlapping. There's no diminishing size. Nothing is made to, be realistic in proportion to each other. The sizes of the figures don't line up. Of course, there obviously is no scientific or atmospheric perspective. It is dynamic on the crossed canals and the eagle, more stable on the figures of the rulers inside the sacred quarter, that would be called, where they're kneeling, and then the warriors at the bottom are dynamic. The border is stable, of course. And then we have balance. It is, of course, balanced with the 4 equal quadrants, and the figures not exactly but closely balanced, with the human and other objects arranged around the 4 quadrants of the city, and the warriors. And there, you see the 2 smaller figures below the warriors, below their shields, would indicate enemies being conquered by the Aztec warriors. They're roughly balanced. Left to right, top to bottom, it has a rough balance. And of course it has rhythm with repeated shapes of the figures and the lines for the canals and the plants. Those are some of the other objects between the kneeling leaders, are other types of tropical plants, as well as the cactus, which has rhythm. Okay. This slide is calendar stone from Mexico, actually Mexico City today. And it's rough, circa, little c, for about 1500. We don't have the exact date. This records the Aztecs' belief in the fact that they thought there were 4 previous worlds that existed before their time or their era, the Aztec world. And they are documenting those in this calendar, which also marks, various time in their world, their current Aztec world or culture. But first, where it was found is interesting. It was found while workers were excavating for the Mexico City subway, and in the late 70s, I believe it was, and somewhere just behind the main cathedral, just off of Zocalo, the main public square in the heart of Mexico City. And of course, at that time, it was Tenochtitlan. And this documents their main belief about the sun god being their most powerful god, and that there were, as you see in the middle, there's a face, right, in a circle. That image is a hybrid or a blend of the features of the sun god and the earth gods. The god in the middle there has a flint-like, stone-like tongue projecting out of its mouth. And then on either side, or at each of the corners, you could say, there are no quarters, of course, on a circle, but the 4 different squares around that circle, those each contain images of other important deities, but the most important meaning of those is that they symbolize the 4 previous worlds that existed, which the Aztecs believe each had their own sun, and then their gods destroyed the suns, which then, along with the suns, destroyed the worlds that the suns once, shone on, and then that led to the creation of the next and the next. So they believe they were the 5th and most important of the worlds that their gods had created. The symbol of the points that's on the outer edge, or they're pointing out from the, I should say, middle circle there towards the outer edge, those 8 points, those symbolize, or that whole entire construct symbolizes the sun, their sun, the current sun that shines down on the earth as it existed at the time this was made. That appears in a lot of Aztec religious art. And then we have down at the bottom two fire serpents, and their tails are raised, and you can see stylized flames off the top of their tails, and out of their mouths can be seen human faces emerging at the bottom. Those were powerful images, of course, in a lot of other works of Aztec religious art. And then the overall general patterns of repeated geometric shapes around each of the circles that go all the way out to the outer edge. This, by the way, is a 12-foot wide stone, which is now on display in the Museum of Anthropology in Mexico City. And it's one of the world's great museums of history, well worth a day's visit if you're ever in Mexico City. So it's massive and heavy, and it was meant to be, if not the main, one of the main markers of their major events, their past history, and predicting some of the future events. And some historians believe that this calendar had symbols that predicted the end of their own world, which of course did come to pass about 22 years later, assuming the date of 1500 is accurate, when the Spanish destroyed the Aztec Empire in Tenochtitlan and replaced it with their capital, Mexico City. Okay, formal analysis. It is balanced, totally symmetrical in every way, top to bottom, left to right, full of the rhythm of the points around the outer edge of the sun, the four heads of different deities in those boxes near the middle, and of course all the geometric patterns, the two serpents. Everything is dynamic. There's nothing stable about it. It's a cool gray color. The modeling is the shadows created by the light from the museum, but of course originally it would be from sunlight. Carved line is used to create simulated textures on the faces of the gods inside the circle and the other four boxes, as well as the serpents. There is no real technique for space because it doesn't really depict space, except you could say there's overlapping of the images of the faces of the gods with the background of the stone itself, and then the two serpents near the bottom definitely do overlap the patterns behind them. And then the whole thing is primarily a rhythmic oriented piece that's powerful. Of course, the rhythms, repeated squares, circles, and points, are what this piece is most evocative of. The powerful rhythms of their own beliefs in their gods and the cycles of their history. Okay. This next slide is Templo Mayor, Spanish for Major Temple, in Mexico City, and the date is also circa 1500. This is another one of those sites. This is a recreation of course, an artistic rendering of what it most likely looked like when it was new. And this temple would have been the most important temple, probably the largest, the tallest in the capital, Aztec capital city of Tenochtitlan. And so this would have been, right, in fact it is now being excavated, has been rediscovered. I think it was in the late 70s when some excavation for a certain construction project was happening just behind Zocalo, the main square. Anyone who's been to Mexico City knows where that is, that huge public square in front of the cathedral. So just behind that. Only the top part has been excavated, but it's enough to tell what it looked like. And so this was a pyramid of over 200 feet in height with a double staircase and some would say twin, but I would say paired temples at the top because they're not identical, but they're side by side. And this would have been, of course, a sacrificial site for human sacrifice, as well as other religious, not only human sacrifice, but other religious rituals. If you look closely at the slide, you can see a little hint of blood trailing down one of the staircases. And as probably people know, if they've studied the history of the Aztecs, they believed they had to appease their gods to protect themselves, to keep their people safe and prosperous and healthy, ensure, successful crops, and that even the sun, to keep the sun in the sky. They believed that was part of their religious teachings, that the priests conducted the ceremonies in order to appease the gods. And of course those were enemies that they were captured in battle or otherwise brought to the site. They were marched up the stairs, and then their hearts were cut literally out of their body while they were still beating, and the rest of the bodies were thrown down the staircases and then dismembered at the bottom. There was and I've seen it, you can see it now reproduced in the upper half of this temple that's now visible and has been excavated in Mexico City, of a skull rack with hundreds is what I counted, but according to the textbook it would have been thousands of actual severed human heads, which of course eventually turned into skulls that were on display at the bottom of the plaza of past sacrificial victims is probably the right word. The temples behind where the sacrifice is occurring at the top of that plaza would have been actually that's where the skull rack probably was too, but I don't see it here in this rendering. And the temples behind them are where various rituals were conducted, not only human sacrifices, and the priests would gather to conduct various types of religious ceremonies throughout the year, especially harvest season, planting season, and changes of the seasons, from winter to spring to summer to fall to autumn and so forth. And so this is typical of Aztec temple construction. It's very similar to what existed in Teotihuacan, an earlier culture that we discussed if you took Art 1.1 World Art, preceded the Aztecs and still exists outside Mexico City. Those pyramids are even taller. Some of them reach 300 feet. This one is something slightly over 200 or 220 to the tops of those two temples. Okay, it's almost balanced but slightly weighted toward the right because one of the two temples is taller. It's a cool gray color on the stone, but there is some painted exterior warm reddish or rust almost color on the walls and on the roof of the temple to the right. It's both stable and dynamic. The edges of the pyramid, of course, and its base are stable, but the staircase and the sides, of course, of the steps of the step pyramid, that's the only kind the Mesoamerican culture created, step pyramids, are dynamic, are diagonal. The rhythm is obvious with those different steps, and then the real steps, you can't quite see them here on, of course, the staircase had the same shape, same width and height, and then the two temples, walls of the temples are similar, slanting upward. So there's a lot of rhythm. It's dynamic on those features I just mentioned, of course, and stable again on the corners. And then the largest mass, it's pretty obvious, it's the base, the pyramid proper, if you count it as one mass. And then it would be the staircases, and then the larger of the two temples. The texture is the real rough texture of stone. There really isn't any simulated textures. And the modeling would just be shadows from the sun, and the line here would be carved line that, of course, would be visible. Well, it's not in this drawing, but if you got up close, you'd see animals carved along the edges of the staircases. Serpents, mostly, one of their most sacred creatures. That they worship gods that look like serpents, as we just discussed in the last slide of the calendar stone. But you can't see them here, so for this slide you would just say that there is just visual line at the corners. And it's roughly balanced left to right, as I was saying, unbalanced toward the right, but of course unbalanced clearly towards the bottom. Okay. This is Machu Picchu, Machu Picchu, Peru, circa 1400. Well, it was constructed over several decades, so 1400s, but probably the earliest phase was begun around 1400 AD or CE. This would have been one of the major cities, some say a second capital city, more protected and further away from potential attack than what was the forerunner of Cusco, Peru, where the original Incan Empire had a capital, which is not in the lowlands by any means, but not up in the mountains like this. This is over, I believe it's 12,000 feet. It's in that range, roughly, feet above sea level. So it's one of the tallest or highest elevations of any major city in the world at that time, if not would be today if it was still inhabited. Of course, it's been abandoned after the Spanish conquered the Incas in the 1540s. So for not quite, a century and a half, it was one of their two most important cities. And the buildings almost all survived, minus their wooden roofs, which of course disappeared or rotted away long ago. But the setting is spectacular. I have a friend who travels to Peru regularly, and he's the only person I know who spent time here. He said it's so breathtaking that you don't notice the altitude sickness that strikes most Western visitors, or certainly Americans when they visit here, because it's so far up in the mountains that you have to adjust because of the thin oxygen. The Incas had obviously already made that adjustment when they built this city. And it's built out of this fitted stone, this kind of stone that goes back all the way to the early Babylonians and Greeks, especially the very early Greeks in Mycenae. If you took our 1.1, you might remember discussing that with the city of Mycenae on the mainland, the Peloponnese section of Greece, with 3,500-year-old fitted stone walls that are still standing. Not intact, but primarily about 4/5 the height of the original. About 80% of the original walls of cities like that have survived in parts of Europe, because the fitted stone is some of the strongest construction method known to human beings that far back in the ancient times. So here it was used here in what would then be, of course, in Europe, the Middle Ages. And it's terraced because there's not a lot of flat land available. So they did farming along these terraces and managed to produce much of their own food, though some of it had to be imported from down below. But the population was sheltered, several thousand. Some think as many as 30,000 people, but it's probably 15 to 30,000 in all of these buildings, including, you can see near the bottom, just to the right of the middle, where the peaked gables are, and of course they're missing between them the walls and the roof beams and the actual wooden roof, or that would have sheltered the interior. But the stone portions are intact. The foundations everywhere are intact. And then there's an open plaza in the middle where they would have had public events, religious ceremonies, and important rituals. And then, of course, there are some of the larger buildings, like, again, near the middle of the bottom half. There's a very large rectangular building with, of course, walls, minus the roof, that are fairly high, and that would have been perhaps a religious ceremonial structure or government headquarters of some kind for perhaps whoever the rulers of this city were, the local rulers, to have audiences with the citizens if they had questions or problems that they needed to address their rulers with. And so this city has been abandoned for now several centuries, and it was lost, actually. Well, misplaced isn't the word, but literally unknown is a better word to say, to a lot of Western historians, though it was rumored to still be up in the Andes for quite a while. The local population, of course, would have known about it, but a lot of Western historians didn't know if it still existed. And sometime in the last 100 or whatever, maybe a little over 100 years, it was rediscovered by archaeologists from North America, I believe, or Europe. Okay, it's balanced roughly because the main plaza in the middle divides the areas of structures of buildings roughly equally. It's all real rough texture of stone on the walls. It's cool gray color. It would have been warm when the roofs in the wood portions of the buildings were still intact. And then we have modeling. Well, it's obviously deep shadows created by the sun, so it's natural modeling. For space, that's a little harder to analyze at this distance in this photo, but certainly some of the buildings have walls that are easily 20 feet high, and the houses probably 10 to 12 feet on average for the roofs. And then, of course, there are varying sizes of public buildings as well as residential structures. The rhythm is obvious. It's both stable on the outer walls of some of the larger rectangular structures and the terracing, excuse me, and dynamic on the peak gables of a large number of the houses. And then, let's see, I already mentioned cool, shadow, line. Yeah, this is just visual line is used here around the corners of the building. If you're up close, you might see some carved line, but that's not visible here. And the largest mass, well, maybe the plaza, because that is terraced and lined with stone, now overgrown with moss or grass, but that was part of the structural elements of this site. And then after that, it would have to be one of the larger public buildings, perhaps the one closest to the bottom of the picture, or one of the others that look wider towards the plaza, closer to the plaza. And then, of course, the various sizes of houses. Okay. This slide is a llama. Of course, that's Llama, from Bolivia, circa 1400s. This would have been an Incan artifact, which is one of the few to escape the Spanish conquest, in which this is made of solid silver, and there would have been many silver and gold, solid gold and silver figurines of both human figures and animals, as well as some of their gods, which the Spanish just melted down and made into ingots and sent back to Spain when they created their empire. And so this survived. It's a rare survivor, and it captures the spirit of if you've ever been up close to a llama, as many of us have perhaps, they have a gentle spirit, although they can get a little bit testy if you get too close to them. But I think it captures the persona or personality of an adult llama in an alert pose. It is 9 inches, roughly 9 inches long by about 9 inches high. And it has a handmade blanket, which they would have used on real llamas, on its back, which is painted. That may be a recreation of the original one, because 600-year-old fabric doesn't always hold up that well. But the actual structure, or the body, I should say, of the llama is intact and original. Llamas were nearly sacred creatures. Of course, they were beasts of burden. They were essential for their urban civilization. And they revered them, but they also sacrificed them once a day in the morning. And I think it was at sunrise in the capital, what's now Cusco, to, I guess it would have been one of their gods, of course, most likely the sun god. So they did also use them for sacrifice, but only minimally. Most of the time they took care of the animals and gave them plenty of comfort when they needed to, when they weren't using them as beasts of burden. So this, I think, captures the somewhat affectionate feeling they had for llamas in the Incan culture, and it was done early enough that this would have been what often some historians call the golden age of the Incan Empire, when it stretched almost the entire length of the Andes mountain range, thousands of miles north to south in South America. And their road system was more developed than any in Europe, as you may know. They had messengers who, sort of like a human version of the Pony Express, they relayed each other with important written messages or documents they could take back and forth between different parts of their empire in, I think it was 2 days, or a very short time, 2 or 3 days, from one length of the empire to the next. In a few days, and there was no mail service in Europe at that time. Kings, of course, had some kind of couriers, and so did some wealthy families, but there was no general communication system, and the roads were terrible in Europe. So they had a superior road system in what's now the Andes Mountains of South America. under the Incas than the European cultures did at that time, because 1400, of course, is still the late Middle Ages in Europe. Okay, it's a cool silver color. Of course, it's got carved line to create the eyes and the mouth and the nose, full of the rhythm of the bodies, the legs, the hoofs, the ears. It's entirely stable. Look carefully, you see it's all stable. It's a single mass, unless you want to count the blanket on the back as a second mass. For space, it's a real three-dimensional object. There's no real technique for space. 9 inches high and 9 inches long. It's a single mass. It's balanced. And yeah, I think we mentioned there's no modeling. It's just the shadows from the museum. Okay. This slide is Bandolier Bag, Bandolier bag from Kansas, 1860. And this illustrates the influence of the European and, well, in this case, by this time, American culture, Western culture on the Plains Indians' art. Bandolier, of course, as many of you know, is a military object which a soldier, starting in as far back as probably the 1400s or 1500s anyway, would have put across their shoulders, and in the front they would have the bag itself containing ammunition for the then early form of rifles. By 1860, of course, rifles were fairly advanced and Indians possessed them. Their warriors used rifles, obviously, and horses, both of which were imported, of course, from Europe. So this shows European influence, but the designs, the patterns, the techniques, although some of the materials are not Native American, the artwork itself is. The materials are cotton and wool fabric, silk threads, and beads, glass beads. And they're rendered in beautifully done geometric patterns, what looks like X's, some would say, on the right shoulder. Well, to us, on our side, the right shoulder strap. And on the other side are leaf patterns, which for all the world look to me like tulip blossoms, but I don't think there were tulips on the... Maybe there were by this time on the prairies in Kansas. There might have been. But in any case, they're flower motifs outlined in white, beautifully rendered and creating really strong rhythms. We'll do the formal analysis in a couple minutes. And then the actual bandolier bag, per se, of course, would hang down below the waist of the wearer, and that's at the bottom. And so this is a piece that total is about almost 8. The bandolier bag itself would be about 8 inches wide by 2. Well, that can't be right. So it's about 2 feet. I should say 2 feet wide. Stockstead has it as 8 inches. I gotta believe it's wider than that, or it wouldn't hold much ammunition. But about 2 feet tall. And the colors, of course, are various earth tones alternating with blue that were from vegetable dyes, created by vegetable dyes. So let's do the formal analysis. It's balanced, of course, totally symmetrical. You could say it's weighted left to right, certainly balanced, but you could say it's unbalanced or weighted toward the bottom because the bag, of course, fills most of the bottom area, and it's empty space in the middle where the Indian warrior would put their head and shoulders, and the chest, of course, would show through. The rhythms are obvious with the floral patterns created along the left side, and the some say they're plant motifs as well, but in the shapes of X's, creating strong rhythm. It's dynamic. I don't really see many straight lines in it. Everything is at a diagonal. The colors alternating between warm pinks and browns and reds and cool different shades of blue and white. There is line here, bold outline, beautifully done. It must have been a very time-consuming, very refined process to create these outlines around the floral patterns, and there were X's or plant patterns on the other side. Everywhere the lines you can see here are bold white lines. The largest mass would be the shoulder straps, and then the actual bandolier bag. And then we would have no simulated texture. It's implied slightly, but there really is none, and no modeling visible on this. Let's see, I think that's about it. Okay. This slide is a hide painting battle scene made from buffalo hide. It's from North Dakota, and we pretty much are sure the date it was completed was 1800 because it was nearly new, only a few years old, when Lewis and Clark found it, and whatever they traded for it, they were given this as a gesture, perhaps of goodwill, because their expedition, of course, was an exploration one, not of conquest, not yet. That happened later. And when they brought it back with them, I guess at the end of their expedition would have been about 1804, it was in excellent condition, it was nearly new, and they presented it to President Thomas Jefferson. Of course, he's the one that assigned them to make their westward explorations, and maps and notes about the great expanse of the Louisiana Purchase that the U.S. had just bought from Napoleon, from the French, expanding the U.S.'s territory by 100% at that point in our history. And so for many years, I think throughout the rest of Thomas Jefferson's lifetime, I believe including while he was president, he had this displayed in the entry hall of his mansion Monticello in Virginia, where he had lived before and after he was president. And now it's on display in, I believe it is a museum in Massachusetts that has acquired it. This is commonly done type of artwork done with, probably vegetable dyes with some kind of quill-like instrument to create the figures on a skinned buffalo hide, which is about 8 feet in height and, 9 feet in height by about 8 feet wide. Skinned buffalo. You can even see the remnants of its face a little bit where the eyes would be, right, and the snout on the far left end. It depicts a victory, a major victory, which we actually know the year of that victory was 1797, so this was created within the next few years after that, by this particular tribe that had traded with Lewis and Clark. And it depicts their victory over one of their Indian rival tribes. This would have been a Mandan, M-A-N-D-A-N, relic from the Mandan tribe, which would have been in what's now the Dakotas, North or South Dakota area of the plains. And this shows horses with riders, warriors, of course, on horseback with their weapons in battle, and it's got literally dozens of figures, and they each are in motion or in movement, so it's full of action or activity, and it would have been a historical document that the culture was creating to celebrate, you could say, and commemorate a great military victory they had won over one of their enemies. Okay, to do the formal analysis, it's a warm color, as you can see from the color of the skin, of course, or hide of the buffalo itself by nature is going to be warm earth tones. And the figures, the human figures, some of them are colored in, especially the horses, I should say figures, horses and humans. Some of the humans are too. Others, though, they're just outlined. So they all, though, have the warm background color, of course, of the hide itself. So there really aren't any cool colors except for the line across what would be roughly the spine of the buffalo hide itself, and that is porcupine quills, which have a kind of white dye color, so that's the only cool part. The rhythm is obvious. The parts of the outer edges of the legs of the buffalo and what's left of its eyes, or holes for where the eyes would be, and of course all of the horses and riders, the warriors, those figures are all full of rhythm. It's done with bold outline around almost all the figures. There is really no modeling unless you count the fact that a third maybe of the figures are colored in, and if you consider that modeling, but it really just coloring, so there isn't really any modeling, and there's no simulated texture. It's implied perhaps a little bit on the horses, but really in any way simulated. And it's balanced. Of course, it's an animal hide, but you could say it's slightly weighted toward the right side because of the extra long section where the legs, the hind legs or back legs of the bull would have been. It's bison is the right word. I've been saying bull. It's a common misconception or misuse of that term. It's a bison. Buffalo, of course, is what most people call it. Not really a bull at all. Sorry. Okay, so then we have balance, top to bottom. The figures balance roughly, although some people see more figures above the middle than below. But the actual hide itself is balanced top to bottom. Pretty much symmetrical, as would be any remaining intact hide from any large mammal. And then there's a real texture of, smooth of course, of the actual buffalo skin. Okay. Oh, for space, there's only overlapping. Yeah, I didn't want to forget that. You see the figures overlapping their horses. And where they're in battle, there's some overlapping of their weapons with each other. Okay. This slide is Grizzly Bear House Screen, originally from Canada, circa 1840 or 40s. These are cedar planks upon which are painted all of the colors with actual paint. And it is 8 feet wide by 15 feet tall. And it was for the entrance to the house of a chief of a village of the Tlingit, that's T-L-I-N-G-I-T people from Native American culture in what's now Canada. And it's now in a museum in Denver, Colorado. This culture had quite an abundance of food and materials for shelter and clothing. They lived in a very, when we say rich, not in the Western sense of the word, but a very abundant natural setting of the Northwest, what today we call the Northwest of the U.S., or it actually is the Southwest of Canada, along the Pacific coast or near that area, along the West Coast, the northwestern culture of North America, or coast, I should say. And of course, that is an area, if you've been up there, is green. I mean, everything is green and lush. It's actually got rainforests in it. So they didn't have to worry about shortages of what they needed, essential supplies and things. And they often shared with some of their neighboring villages or even other cultures nearby. And they also would give large amounts of food and crafts and raw materials like wood, timber, and so forth to some of their fellow citizens or other neighboring tribes as a show of goodwill, but also showing off their wealth. Here what we have is a specific image of one particular family who had the grizzly bear, or maybe this whole tribe in this entire village, the grizzly bear as their symbol. And it's just as charming as can be. As you see, it's a grizzly bear with almost human-like hands raised up. And again, that's not the symbol of stop, keep out, stay away. That's what Western culture implies. It's much more like a welcoming entrance way to the house of the chief. Of course, people had to be welcome to come in to talk to the chief about their problems or questions or needs that they had. And so you see faces all over it, painted in dark black outline of grizzly bear heads. And then the main face in the upper half, the wide oval face with smaller faces as the nostrils and eyes, and then thick eyebrows and lips. It's very whimsical, deliberately so. The hole in the bottom is the entrance you would pass through. You'd have to duck to get in, and it also is symbolic of the vagina of the actual figure, the large figure of the grizzly bear. And that is meant to symbolize the birth canal through which every living creature, or not every living creature, I should say, every mammal, humans included, obviously have to pass to be born. And so you pass through that to get in to see the chief, or if you're in the family, to go back into your family compound. So that's the meaning. Formal analysis is, well, already said for space, it's real three-dimensional space. I don't think you can say there's really any overlapping, because it's 15 feet tall and about, I think it's 8 feet wide, right? But you might think of there being some overlapping, perhaps, of the faces if you count them as something else. But if they're integrated as they're supposed to be, as details on the body of the larger image of the main figure, the large grizzly bear, then there's no overlapping. It's just real space. Balanced? Yes, of course. Definitely. Symmetrical, balanced, left to right and top to bottom. The rhythm is obvious with the various faces of the grizzly bears and the details of the face of the main figure, and some geometric pattern in the middle above the opening. And the textures, they're real rough texture of cedar. There really isn't any simulated texture here. And there is no modeling. There's bold outline around the faces of the grizzly bears, especially on the face, the main face, used, of course, as the outer edges of the eyes and nostrils. And you could make the case that the mouth, the dark black where the lips would be, is thick outline, as well as the heads of in the ear areas at the top of the two smaller faces of grizzly bears. So there's some slightly thinner but even still bold dark black outline, and then very thick bold outlines. And then the colors are warm. Of course, the wood itself is obviously a warm color, but the body is warm, and the background of the head, the main face, I should say, of the larger grizzly bear is kind of a light yellowish tan color. But we do have the neutral, of course, colors of the black patterns and outlines. And then for mass, well, it really appears to be one mass, but if you broke it down, you'd probably have to say the head of the grizzly bear is the largest, and then the arms and legs are about the same, and then the ears. Okay. This last slide is of Taos Pueblo. That's Taos Pueblo. Of course, it's Pueblo. New Mexico, circa 1500. The Pueblo Indians, who occupied what's now called the southwest of the United States, were a very advanced culture among Native American cultures, in that they had permanent cities or large towns. We might not call them cities today because they only held a few thousand people, but they were good-sized communities for the environment that were permanent. And they're still there. Some of you may have gone to New Mexico, and if you haven't gone, you should go, not just to Albuquerque or Santa Fe, the two main tourist sites, but Taos, which is well worth the side trip, in the northern mountains of New Mexico. You can see the mountains from here. This is an old photo from the 40s, but it hasn't changed that much, except there's a little bit more touristy, sites around it. But the actual structures still existed pretty well intact. They're built of brick with plaster or adobe. Some people call it mud brick, or sometimes later on, when the Spanish had arrived, they actually got plaster to cover over the walls of brick. And they are in stepped, terraced setbacks. That's the best way to describe how each of these rows of houses, up to 5 levels. The top level, you see the tallest one in the middle there that shows up against the distant mountains in the background. That's 5 stories. It's a rather major structures, though that actually matches the height of the tallest residential structures in the Roman Empire. Of course, the Colosseum was taller than this, and some of their temples were. But their residential structures, I've seen them outside Rome. There's still some intact that have been, preserved. Were at most 5 stories tall in the largest empire up to that time, and the wealthiest and most advanced in the ancient world. These are equally tall, the parts of them anyway. Most of these are 2 and 3 stories, these different sections. And families of extended families, I should say, of several generations could live under each roof. And the ladders are for people to enter. Now they have doors. You see the doors. Some of them have screens in front of them already by the late 40s. That wouldn't have been uncommon. But earlier, when this area was not yet overtaken or conquered by the Spanish invaders in the mid to late 1500s, when it was first built, you would have entered these homes from the roof by climbing up a ladder and going down another ladder into your house. And that helps, A, protect it, and B, the walls insulate from too much heat in the summer and too much cold air in the winter to a certain degree. Makes them a little more comfortable than they would otherwise be. And you notice they don't really have windows. Now some of them have carved small windows out of the walls. And then there's a plaza in front, which would have been used for ceremonial events and large public gatherings, the kind that we can't enjoy now for the next year or more, who knows when. But of course that wasn't a concern here. And that would also have been when the chiefs would have addressed their tribe, the members of their tribe, about an important event or a task that they had to do, or harvesting, or if there was a drought, how to deal with various challenges or tasks that the people had to work on together. As far as we know, this was never abandoned, though, due to a drought or a plague. There were still people living, at least there were when I went there in the 1980s. I assume there still are now. As to whether they're all direct descendants of the original inhabitants, that's unlikely, but they could be. At least some of them could be. The Spanish learned from this kind of construction, and what they called adobes. You know that word, many of you, of course. Here in California there are hundreds of them left from the old Spanish times, but much later than this, from the 17 and 1800s, when the Spanish saw how these buildings were constructed with local materials from the earth, of mud brick and an early kind of a plaster-like material, and of course wood beaming for the roofs and the corners of the buildings. So those materials were readily available from the natural surroundings, and the Spanish used similar techniques for their adobe homes that they began building once they conquered the western and southwestern areas of what's now the United States. So this had an ongoing, this kind of construction, indigenous, native construction, that had been around for thousands of years, actually. They go back as far as 1,500, even 2,000 years ago in the Southwest. In various parts of New Mexico and Arizona, you can still see some much older than this, of this kind of Pueblo-style construction. And sometimes on the side of a mountain, where they are sheltered by an overhanging cliff, as in Colorado, one of the most famous sites. Some of you may have seen Ansel Adams photograph those, some of those places. Those go back at least 15 centuries, some of those, and maybe more, possibly 2,000 years. So it's a very ancient method of construction that the Spanish then were influenced by in their colonial architecture. Okay, formal analysis. Well, is it balanced? In this photo, you'd have to say it's weighted toward, if you were to stand right in front of it on the plaza looking at it, the tallest section is to the right of the middle of this portion. So you'd have to say it's unbalanced or weighted toward the right. But each individual structure is balanced, of course. And then you have the natural texture of the smooth plaster. In this case, it is plaster at this point, but it would have been perhaps dried mud before that, or some other kind of a natural material over the stone walls. And those would have, of course, rough texture, or smooth if it's plaster, rough if it's mud brick. And the original stone, and of course wood beaming, is all natural, real textures of rough wood and stone. This is a black and white photo, so I can just tell you they're warmer tones, kind of a sand colored, and then the wood beams are usually a darker brown. So there's no cool colors, even though the photo looks cool. The rhythm is obvious. These are almost all rectangular one-story buildings with projecting beams. Creates very great rhythm. And of course, there is a stable quality to each individual structure, although the grouping of the ones that rise up to the 5th level, the tallest section here in the on the right side of this section or segment, might make it seem dynamic because they rise up from lower to narrower, wider at the bottom to narrower at the top, but everything is pretty much right angles and straight lines, so it's almost entirely stable. There's no modeling except for the shadows from the sun that obviously you can see in this photograph. And there's only visual line around the edges. The largest mass would be the houses almost all appear to be within a small difference of the same size to each other. But it does appear the one at the very top level, if that's 4th and 5th story, where it rises to the highest height in the background, if that's a single structure, it could be, then that would be the largest mass. Otherwise, they're pretty similar in masses. And for space, you have 1-story rectangular rooms, usually single rooms, sometimes divided perhaps down the middle with a partition, with low ceilings, relatively low, about 8 feet at most. Some of them higher, though, of course, the larger ones for larger families or families that could afford to build bigger ones, they might have ceilings as high as 9 or 10 feet, but not very high ceilings. So open, real space, there's no technique for space. Okay.